It is such a pleasure to have every month the Future Proof Masterclass and somebody brilliant and doing things beyond good uh, and having conversations with people about all of the interesting things. Often people who've written books, but Theodora Lau is really a guru in fintech. I met her through um, the internet, as all good relationships start, through Daniel Guzman, who pointed out her book and said, "You need to look at this. This is amazing." So Theo and I hopped on a call, and it turns out she's from Hong Kong, and is, which is where I'm based, and some of you are based, and I started reading her book and was totally blown away because it is about stakeholder capitalism and doing things well, and sort of doing how do we all say it? Sorry, Theo, doing good by doing well. I can't even remember how that goes, but it really is a guide to the future. So Theo, I just want to welcome you to the conversation as we get started, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's delightful. And yes, I do appreciate the internet most of the time for what it can do because it connected us and serendipity, right? I was born and raised in Hong Kong and here we are in different parts of the world.
Wow. Yeah, don't sound like Loy.
No, it's more like a mess right now, but yeah, thank you.
So I really loved your book, and as I mentioned, I was like, this is the book I wanted to write after I wrote my book, and you said this is write the next one because I had to cut out 10,000 words. So if I could just start um, with this, the thing I loved is you said this is the start of an important conversation about the future, a better future, one where we purposely choose to consider how best to fulfill how best, you probably can say it as well as me, I wrote it here, how best to fulfill the needs and aspirations of every individual within every community. Like, I'm going to have that tattooed on my arm. That's such a beautiful sentence. But what I want to know is what spurred you to write the book and also to feel like that's your mission?
Well, so you want the beautiful version or the real version?
No, I want the ugly version. That's exactly what I'm about. Give it.
So the real version was, so my business partner, Bradley Lima, who's based in San Francisco and based in DC, we've started our business a few years ago, and that is the premise of what we do. We both came from corporate for 20 something years, and we've seen, I wouldn't say we've seen it all, because I'm sure there are tons of things we had not seen, but we've seen enough. And throughout our work, we spent a lot of time working with startup founders, helping them get access to capital, helping them through with business models and trying to figure out how to give them a lift. And we kept running into the same problem over and over and over again. People with great ideas couldn't get access to the resources they need because they have a different skin color that people come to expect in Silicon Valley, because they do not belong to certain cohorts of elite graduate schools, if you will, so on and so forth. And the stories was always the same. And we decided that we want to do something different because we know how to help lift people up. We see good ideas, we recognize good ideas. We want to be the connector, if you will, and help them be successful. And that's the premise of our work. And so we've been doing it for a few years. We have our own podcast called One Vision, where we bring on different entrepreneurs to talk about their journey and their stories. We've done a lot of writing, a lot of speaking. And next thing you know, a publisher in the UK approached us and said, hey, we love the story that you've been writing. Would you be interested in writing a book talking about how technology can do good? This was 2019 when the world was slightly different, and we were excited. We wanted to tell the story, and we started forming all of these ideas of people we want to reach out to that we've known. We want to use this platform as a way to tell their story, to say, this is how it could be done. And perhaps there's something we could learn from it. 2020 happened. And let's just say our world was turned upside down. And like I mentioned to you, Dinah, earlier, I have kids. And so the kids kind of got into a completely different motion, if you will. We had to take a break. We took a break from work to get our families in order. We took a break from writing. And when we came back after 3 months, we had this urgency that it is even more important than ever to tell the story. A lot of the things that we talk about, the inequality that exists within our society, regardless of if you're in a developing or developed economies, the challenges that we see with entrepreneurs or with consumers getting access to financial services, all of these are not new. But what happened with COVID was we noticed that challenge got even more so than how it was before. And so we dedicated one full chapter to talk about the urgency of needing to change. And we reached out to a lot of our friends around the world and asked them to pitch in to tell us what they think the future needs to be and how collectively, as a virtual community, like how we're gathering together, can create a change. I strongly believe that if you can change the mind and the hearts of 3-5 people, and they go on and change the hearts and mind of 3-5 people collectively, we can make a difference. So that's the romantic version of it.
What's the ugly version?
We love punishment.
Oh.
we wrote the bulk of the book in the summer when we were trying to catch up, and it was brutal. Yeah. I think going back, I probably would have done it a little bit differently. I underestimated what it took to write 60,000 words. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's like childbirth. It's nice when it comes
Yes.
out, and it's probably nice when you think about making it. And then there's that middle part. So yeah, I get that ugly part. But what's been what's the change? You've had the book out. What's the change that you've been most delighted to see in terms of this as a catalyst?
Um, I've been delighted to meet different people that have similar ideas on why we need to change. Because we've been gathering friends, if you will, for the last few years, ever since we started the company, just to look for like-minded people and see what we can do together. And the book came out in April in the US, and I've been pleasantly surprised by a lot of different strangers and popping in notes in my inbox and, wanting to tell their story and wanting to work together to see how they can make the world a slightly better place. So that is encouraging. It is not an easy read, though, I would say. It takes perseverance to get through the whole book because we threw in a lot of numbers in there.
You put a lot of data in there, and I will say that it is the most global business book that possibly I've ever read. And so that was, I'm just going to mute you, Steve. That's okay. So it really was fantastic in terms of, using examples from Indonesia and from China and from all across Asia, in addition to the US and Europe. And so, how did you find these stories? That was one of the things that, in terms of inspiration, I think all of us, like all the future proofers, we talk a lot about, okay, let's find the thing I love and let me figure out how to make a difference in that way. So how did you find these stories and decide what to put in the book? And can you tell us your favorite?
Oh, I can't say that. Then I'll upset some people. But I love to talk to people. I think that's something that is part of the personality. And before COVID, we traveled a lot. We speak in a lot of different events in Europe and Asia. and obviously in the US. And so just through these conferences and meetups and serendipity moments, you find each other, right? A lot of these is being intentional in looking for different voices. I think that in itself, the word intention is important in the work that we do and how we write the book and choose the stories that we tell. And that's one of the big things with our podcast as well. We don't seek people who are well known to come tell their story, because guess what? They already have the platform. They don't need more. What we want to do is we want to use our platform to lift up the voices that people don't often hear. It's just like Twitter or LinkedIn, right? The social media. Whoever speaks the loudest always get heard. Well, but what about the people who don't speak as much, but they still have a good idea? Or what about the people who don't have the network, but they have an amazing company? There are lots of things that we can learn from each other, right? And I think that in itself is the challenge that we see with the society today, is we are so cocooned in our own little bubble, and us, especially in the States, that we stopped looking outside because we thought we know the best. We thought we do everything the best. But especially from fintech innovation, I would say most of the inspirational moments, great ideas, oftentimes it comes from Asia, it comes from Africa, it comes from entrepreneurs that been through more, that have a collective lived experience, that make their solution that much more nimble and that much better.
Well, definitely. I think that some of the constraints that you mentioned in other places and just differences. I mean, here in Asia, it's so many different markets, and the US is a giant homogenous market, and it's got sort of, maybe some infrastructure problems, but it sort of plays by rules that are already set. So tell me, it's interesting that you talk about having the voice of the sort of the little guy. I did see a lot about, Alibaba and, Prudential. So what's an example of one of the little folks in the book that you thought was a real guiding light for other people?
So one of the examples that I use a lot, and we talk about them a lot, I wouldn't say a little guy, but they're also not huge by the scale of Prudential or whatnot, is a bank called Sunrise Banks, is in the US, and it's in the Middle East with Midwest, sorry, with headquarters in St. Paul, Minnesota. It is a certified B Corp. So being a financial institution and being a certified B Corp is interesting, right? Because when we think about banks, we think about the profit motive, we think about the business model and whatnot, and then tying them to you can actually have purpose while making a profit is really interesting. So Sunrise, they serve immigrant communities within the Midwest. They provide products beyond just your typical checking and current accounts and whatnot. They also look for financial education. They look for solutions to help mid to low income folks in
Mhm.
the society. And they also give back every year, a minimum 2% of their net income back to their community. And they're one of the best. They're named one of the best in the world by B Lab for 7 years consecutive. And when we look at companies, we look at what it is that make them good. It's not just the action that they contribute back to the society. It's also looking back inwards. Who do they have as employee base, right? Who do they hire? And over half of their employees are women, and 30% of them are from ethnic minorities. And so that in itself is an example of when you're doing good, when you're trying to be inclusive, it's not just about the people that you serve, it's also the people that make up your team that you serve the people. Because we always say, if your audience is not homogeneous, then neither should your executive team and neither should the people that create the solutions, because you need to have that lived experience, you need to have the empathy, you need to have all of that backgrounds. And that's what diversity is about. It's not just about race and gender. It's also about your education. It's also about where you come from. It's about education, sexual orientation, gender, everything that create such a diverse ecosystem of thoughts and voice. And so when we look back at Sunrise Banks, the people that they serve are LMI communities, low to mid income, and 30% of their employee base actually come from those communities. And it's really, really interesting way of looking at how they conduct the business. David Riley, him and his dad bought the bank quite a while ago, and they have been able to grow the bank to $1.4 billion in assets. Now, not huge by any means, for a financial institution, but it's good business model. And for him, he said, this is a way to show people that you can actually do good. And doing good doesn't mean being a nonprofit, doesn't mean it's a philanthropy. You can do good while you make a profit as well. And his example is one of my favorite.
Well, that's interesting. You talked about demographics and social mobility in your book. And so in a way, it seems like, if I just paraphrase it at a sort of, simplistic level, is having a company that is built to last is really about having it be good inside and out.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk about one of the things that that I found interesting is measuring, measuring beyond good, actually. And I know that a lot of people on this call are really interested in that. And I'm just wondering, you talked about measuring an alternative vision of success, not purely based on market performance. I've worked with the shared value folks here in Hong Kong, and a lot of us, Damien's here, and he's been involved in that. And I see a number of finance people here as well who have been really thinking about, okay, how do we do it from a financial perspective? And how do we do it from a business owner perspective? Like, what are some of the best measurements? How do people move from, like, it's so much easier to say, okay, a profit's 20%. Now it's going to be 15, whatever it is. You know what I'm talking about.
It's an interesting one. That is a really broad question, but it's an interesting one. So recently, I wanted to say earlier this week, there was a really good article from Washington Post that talked about, okay, we are a year and a half into COVID, and we've been a year after the social movement in the United States that talk about Black Lives Matters. And we have seen a lot of corporates coming out and say, well, we are making donation to try to make a difference, right? You talk about metrics, you talk about actions. What the article in Washington Post went into is looking at the billions that were committed by the corporates that says, I am going to do X, I'm going to give X to try to change the status quo. A year in, what are we looking at? Where did the money go? Have we actually seen change, right? So that's an easy, quote unquote, easy way to look at as a metrics perspective. Some look at, are we seeing more diverse members on the board? Are we seeing a more diverse makeup of people in the executive team? And when we mean diverse, it's not just men and women. It's all about all the other aspects of diversity that you care about, that you want to use as a metric. And as it turned out, a lot of the companies that made the pledge, that they say, we're giving X million dollars or X billion dollars for the cause, much of that ended up in lending products, in vehicles to extend credit to businesses, because that's one of the things that, a lot of the Black and brown business owners had been facing is lack of access to credit to help them extend business. But now, if you ask me, is that a good way to measure whether or not you are contributing to society? I'd say, well, it is one measure, but is that the best? I would say no, because again, it goes back to the intent. Is your intent of wanting to do good for the society actually wanting to uplift them? Or is your intent more to make a statement, what we say a lot of pink washing and rainbow washing and green washing and all the other, appear to be making a positive movement, but in the end is you want to do it because it adds to your bottom line, right? I know that could be a little harsh statement to make, but I would always go back to, when you're, for example, we would have companies that come out and say, well, we already have a woman in our executive board. What more do you need? Well, you need more than one, right? To actually create change, you need more than one. Or when you are introducing diverse members to your executive teams, are they in P&L positions, or are they in, some roles that is an executive level, but they have nothing to do with the financials of the institution, right? So that's another way of looking at it. Is, are you truly making a change, or you want to create the illusion of making a change?
Yeah, it's, some of the stuff that you just mentioned is, so there's so many things that you could potentially measure. So Damien, I'm going to ask you to unmute if you don't mind and ask your question. It's a good one.
Hi there. So I was busy typing, so I was trying not to make typing mistakes. But yeah, I'm just trying. I mean, as I was typing, my point is I haven't had an opportunity yet to read your book, and I'm looking forward to doing that when it arrives. But I think some of the examples you're citing are great. But I guess the question is always, how do you scale them? How do we create more? A lot of this is sort of like a ground up, a bottom up kind of view. I agree with you that a lot of what's been going on the last year, 18 months, I think in the business, which is investment management, there seems to be like a real tipping point. People have just realized that we have to go forward. We can't go back. But I'm interested in your thoughts around how you scale impact in terms of getting people to really embrace this at a more fundamental level.
I'm just reading your comment now. It is indeed a lot of virtual signaling. I think I think that one of the most important thing is, and it goes back to, I know it's a cliche, but it needs to be the DNA of the company, right? It needs to be not just a group of people within the company wanting to do good, but they also need to get executive buy-in. Otherwise, it would just end up becoming an empty PR statement that says we're committing to do X without actually doing it. Is similar to, when we talk about, for example, Sunrise Banks, or I have another example in the US called Tap Bank. They are a financial institution that helps truckers with the financial needs. And so we think about the needs of truckers that, they go from one coast to the other all the time. And so how they access financial services and what they need are very different than day-to-day small business owners or consumers. And so that bank, their products is geared towards serving that demographic of people. And what is very interesting about what they do, similar to Sunrise Banks, is the executive team is completely buying into identifying who are the people that we want to serve. Not everyone, but who are the ones that we want to serve, and what it is that they need, and how much can we understand their need and make sure that from top to bottom to top, that they are in sync with the mission, if you will, or the purpose of the company. And I think that in itself is really important. From all the examples that we have seen so far, Aspiration is a fintech that focus on sustainability and doing good and making sure that the money doesn't go into companies that they invest in that are not good for the environment. It's the same thing, right? It leads from the top, but also get motivated and get galvanized by the team in the bottom.
So what are some of the measurements? I mean, you said that there were some people, but when you look at one of the companies, for all of you listening, if there are really interesting measurements that you've seen, I'd be curious, because I know FSG in San Francisco, for instance, is really working hard to figure out how to measure shared value, for instance, and measure how a company can see if they're progressing. And I worked with a large financial fund, and what we realized is that the ones that had the biggest opportunity were the ones that were the biggest, had the biggest issues. So gambling and tobacco and that kind of thing, if they move the needle, like that was hugely material. So I guess you're talking about it being part of the DNA. If you're in a company and you want to change, how can you do something that really does move the needle? It's similar to Damien's question about scale. It is really like, what can people do as individuals or in companies to like make this actually happen?
It is similar to something that we've been looking at, right, for quite a few years, is why is it that we need to focus on DEI? It's the same thing, right? Now we're focused on ESG. But I think first and foremost, a lot of people will be looking at is, other than it makes good sense from a society perspective, you also need to make sure that it demonstrates that it makes sense from a corporate profit motive perspective. I think that is the hard part, is we need to show that by doing, it's just like a lot of the figures that we've been seeing from a DEI perspective on how when you have a diverse workforce, then this is how it contributes to the bottom line. Is similar to when you're looking at how do we do more for the society. When we say beyond good, it could be, being more creating a more inclusive work environment, creating a more inclusive product and solution, which is something that needs to be done, especially in financial services, or creating something that's more sustainable for the environment, and all of those. It ties back to how we're measuring, for example, ESG, which I believe a lot of the companies is trying to come up with a more universal metrics of doing that. It's still, work in progress in itself. It's the same thing as tying it to one or two goals that is measurable, that you can help to create a change. And it's hard. It's really, really hard. I think that's the one thing I would say is being aware of the challenges of the different demographics in society is one thing. Being aware that there is a need to change is the second step. And actually being able to start creating change, or even creating a small community that you can start changing, is the third step. And that's even harder. And I think it would take a long time, right? So for example, when we look at women empowerment, we look at women economic inclusion, that figure by itself has increased by 30 some years in the last year. And it's over 237 something years, I can't remember now, before women can achieve economic equality. When we think about that, 230 some years, that means that not only my kids wouldn't see it, I mean, forget it, I would never see it, my kids wouldn't see it, their kids won't see it, and perhaps their grandchildren will see it. That is, if we don't burn the planet to the ground. And you see how
Which will
hard
happen for female empowerment or burning it.
yeah, that's a whole different discussion. But you can see a lot of that increase by a generation of before we can get to economic equality was caused by COVID. And COVID in itself and the economic downturn brought out how much in the very beginning, when we say, well, we are all in it together, but we're not. We are in the same storm, but we're in different boats. I mean,
Yeah.
some are in a yacht and some are in a little dinky. And so the question is, what COVID-19 had done is it added to that inequality that we see in the society. So if that is not an enough impediment to get people to actually start thinking about doing better, I don't know what else we need to do.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to go to Rosie and then Steve. Rosie, do you want to unmute and talk about ESG and ask your question?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a really fascinating conversation. I guess there's so many different dimensions to it. But Theo, you just mentioned ESG, and that's something that's kind of very hot on my agenda for the moment. And there's a lot more pressure on businesses now to be focusing on transparency and disclosure, doing the ESG reporting. And I'm just sort of concerned that that doesn't turn into a box ticking exercise where people are going to be saying, I need to do this to comply, rather than I need to do this because there is some material difference that I'm going to make on that E, environmental side, or on that S, that social side. Governance, okay, that's maybe a slightly different dimension, but that's a concern I have. Everybody's talking on so many different dimensions about the need to be measuring and tracking performance, but for the sake of it, or because there is something material that's happening. Have you coming across that?
I'm coming across a lot of tick the box exercise. I have the exact same concern you do, as everyone is so busy going to checking the box and saying, oh, we're doing this, but we're not peeling the onion enough to see what else is behind it. And I think transparency in here is key, is to keep the pressure up. I don't have an easy answer to that, but I worry that it will end up, and it is ending up to be another check the box exercise, just like the pay gap movement. But I would love to hear examples of people actually being able to crack that. I haven't seen anything that's really, really interesting yet.
Thank you. I think that there are interesting examples of people who are making a difference. And Rosie, you might even have some yourself. And oftentimes they do that by being, when you say peel the onion, by making sure every single layer is in alignment. So Damien mentioned like that kind of aligning incentives. And I saw a really interesting note from Dion about, yes, we do Freedom Universal Bank, and we get buy-in because people benefit financially and socially without it costing more. So to a certain extent, I believe that people are interested in, yeah, I'll do that as long as I don't have to, actually do anything, or it doesn't cost more, or, I can still go to the 99 cents aisle at Target and get things that are like made out of plastic, and yes, guilty as charged. But, that kind of thing, like as long as I don't have to do much that's different, then I'm happy to do that in a company or as an individual. So what do you find makes a change? You're like out there telling stories about people who've made a change. What is the catalyst?
Power dynamics. At the end of the day, it all comes down to power and money, right? I mean, as ugly as it might sound. And when you look at who is in charge, who has the money and who has the mic, whoever typically has control of the economics side of things have the microphone, and they are the ones who can actually create the change that you need. So until then, when you can change the power dynamics on the top and who controls the money, I think that will be the key to changing the narrative. And we've seen it in, companies, for example, where when the top layer of the people actually do care, and not care only because, it makes good PR, as, for example, the background they come from. And one of the things when we look at, for example, go back to the startup ecosystem, right? One of the entrepreneurs in New York, he told me something, and it resonated after all these years. He said, people solve problems that they can relate to. So when your leadership level it includes majority of people that come from the same background, they would tend to gravitate towards solutions that they know best. Not because they're ignorant of everything else, it's just because it's human nature, right? You tend to gravitate towards people towards idea you're familiar with, and towards solving a problem in the areas that you're most familiar with. And unfortunately, when we look at where, for example, funding has been going, right? We've been seeing record amount of fintech funding this year. It's unicorns, raining unicorns. I think that's what someone said. They tend to solve a lot of the same problem, right? How many PFM solutions do we need to help people figure out, their what to do, and how much money you have spent on Starbucks coffee last year? What about the ones when fintech revolution first started more than 10 years ago? we promised that technology was going to change and create solutions for people who don't have access to formal financial services. More than 10 years from now, when we thought that revolution was going to be able to bring about a lot of changes, what we have seen is we've seen many replicas of the old with a beautiful paint. There are so many unicorns, for example, in the US and Europe, that originally they started saying, well, we're going to revolutionize financial services. They ended up all serving the same group of people who already have access to financial services, but just with a more beautiful UX. Creating a beautiful user interface does not solve a problem. Looking at how our society has changed and how more people are living longer and living older, and how a majority of that lack access to tools that can actually help them figure out how much money they can afford to spend on a daily basis and how long they need to work, or will they ever run out of money? Those very, very, very basic questions as human beings that we face with eventually is still not being answered unless you have access to a financial advisor, which is the minority of the people, right? Or look at the rise of gig economies, where we create such a romantic way of describing it, the future of work, how you can have flexibility to work when and wherever you want to. But the future of work is not equal. We have people that can do gigs from home because we have access to the internet. We can do a lot of things like how you and I are chatting right now. And then we have the quote unquote essential workers that are out there delivering food for us when we are locked in the house. We have essential workers that are driving and, bringing people from point A to point B. That's a different class of the future workers, or current actually, that don't have the same level of access to services, to financial services that we have come to enjoy, right? That we take for granted. The need to include the needs of gig workers, for example, United States, is still not quite there, right? And so we try to Kuji a solution and force them into a mold that we already built up, and it does not work. So the question is, why aren't we doing more to this growing group of workers who do not have access to benefits, who do not have access to a vehicle to save for retirement long term? Why do we keep creating the same solution over and over and over and over again, right? And that's what technology can promise. And that's how we can bring about change, is looking at the demographics of people that need help the most. The women who are living longer, who outlive their spouse, who, chances are have less in savings and need more help. The folks who are getting older and living older, the adult children that are taking care of them, financial caregiving. That's another big area that I believe if we can actually pay more attention to it, it can uplift more people in the society. Talk about creating change, right? So we are all living longer. We're all living older. Mm-hmm. We have gained a collective 30 years of living, healthy living, since early 1900s. Are we all going to work an extra 30 years? I'm not sure. But how do I know if I will get to a point where, so I'll give an example. I'm 48, right? But my kids are little. I had a family really, really late. And so now my kids are still in primary school. By the time they will be in college, which is about 10 years, I will be almost 60. Now, in the old days, in my parents' time, they would have long retired. But clearly, I would not be able to do that because I have 2 children that I have to put through to college. And student loan debt is one of the highest debts in the US. It's rising like crazy. And think about Theo's life. The whole world is about me. But I will be having to figure out how I can put 2 kids to college in 10 years. At the same time, when my parents who are living in Hong Kong are going to be well in their 80s. And at the same time, I should actually start thinking about my own financial future. I don't have a tool, or any tools for that matter, that can help me plan all of the complexities in life that are all coming in together. We are the sandwich generation. And I know I'm not alone. There are a lot of adult children, people in the 40s and 50s, that will be confronted with the complexity of financial planning in the future. So if we want to make a difference, right, so that this tsunami, or for lack of better words, it's coming, how are we helping these people? Because this is not just a big group of people that are living longer and getting older. This is also a big group of people that are still productive, that they're still working. So how can we continue supporting multiple generations of people in a society if we don't change the way we think about our business, if we don't change the way we think about providing service to these people?
Yeah, I think that there is this whole new extra 30 years, and it's changed our entire lives. And so yet there's a lot of opportunities to solve problems. There's a lot
Yes.
of new problems, and then to reframe, there's a lot of positive opportunities to solve them through businesses that don't necessarily rain their unicorndom down, but they certainly make a huge difference and can make a profit. So Stephen, I know I skipped you. Steve, did you want to ask your question about positive social contribution prototypes? Because I don't know what that is, but it sounds really good.
So Uli and I are involved with Complexity University, and they say a prototype is something you can launch in 48 hours, and they have a 11-day project to reduce emissions by a ton. For me, that's been pretty, yeah, they've done it. They've had 48 different teams go through it. Coming from a more traditional background, we used to think about strategic planning being 3 to 5 years. Now we don't know what's going to happen in 3 to 5 weeks or even 3 to 5 months. And I'm wondering whether companies are adapting their strategies to be more short-term and willing to experiment with what works. And the reason I asked that question, I've heard many times, just recently in Hong Kong, a woman shared that she had a long-term project where the process, the methods, and the outcomes were fixed. She learned very quickly that they needed to adapt within 2 months, but they couldn't get anybody to make the changes, so they just delivered the project per plan. Is that what you still see, or is there some flexibility that's emerging?
I would like to say that I've seen change. And I was once very optimistic, especially seeing how business have changed, quote unquote, changed in the last year, and coming up with new ways to service their customers, right? So for example, in here we've been in, we weren't really in lockdown, but a lot of businesses are still closed. And so a lot of banks, they have to switch and figure out, okay, if my customers are not coming into branches, how do I reach out to them? How do I service them? And I've seen examples of a lot of community banks or some of the regional banks that have been able to pivot. And, for example, they did one of them was my favorite. They did a drive-through. They had a shoot, like something that we used many, many, many years ago, that had the teller still inside the bank, but they don't open the door, and they had something shoot through the drive-through. So interesting ways of trying to cope with change. But seeing how, again, a lot of these banks that have recently come back and asked people to come back to work because they don't think a long-term complete remote work structure is feasible, and seeing how a lot of the projects still take a very, very, very long time and still go through the same check paper. I think change is really hard. Speeding things up is hard, but also the underlying support infrastructure, updating that, being able to support a faster turnaround, I think that's the hardest part. It's not just about people wanting to do something different. Is what is your underlying support processes and systems in place? Unless we can change that, and like you mentioned, from a policy perspective, that's important too, right? So unless all of that auxiliary pieces are changed, I think making a real change in the speed of doing things, I think I haven't been able to see too many examples. There are some. There are a few smaller institutions that have been able to do much better. But by and large, it still seems rigid.
So what about finance? I mean, you have not so much in the book, but like in general, you focus on finance. And there's so much going on in that sector. Do you have hopes for, decentralized finance and blockchain and all of those things? In a way, it's like, forget about the infrastructure of the past. We're just going to do it our own way over here and just build something totally separate. You might think that, but what do you think? Is there an opportunity there?
So that is not an area I dabble much in, but from what I have seen from what some of my colleagues are doing, it does seem like it has a pretty promising future. For example, we've seen a lot of interesting developments in China, right, as well as in some of the other countries. But I think in the big, very traditional, we have everything set in stone for so long, like in the US, for example, I think that might have its own set of challenges.
Well, I think you have, though, really focused in on some of the ideas really about people in work. So the idea of working and living longer and therefore having to work longer or save for retirement. The idea of the gig economy, and it really is that financial piece of, to a certain extent, the way that I read your book is we have to change because these changes, all these drivers have already happened and we haven't caught up yet. And so in a way, there's this opportunity to create new avenues to service, the way people are working, the way how old that they are working, et cetera, which will force change. Do you feel like that is true? I mean, that is like totally through my future of work lens. So.
No, I think in some part,
Yeah.
no, I think in some part it's true. So for example, you look at how Grab Finance, right, and what they have created for their drivers, with Grab Finance, Grab Insure, and, giving them access to, tools that was created because they saw a need in helping the drivers that are part of the Grab ecosystem, right? So that was created because of that, because otherwise Grab was a company that started to solve transportation logistics issues. So that in itself is a good example. And we have seen a lot of what we called specialty fintech, which is a bad word, that have popped up in the last year that address needs because of how the society has changed, right? So we have numerous fintech startups that are focusing on LGBTQ customers because they're not well served by the traditional bank structure and products and services. We've seen fintech startups that have popped up to address needs of immigrants because otherwise it's hard for them to get access to credit because you don't have a credit file in place. Or we have seen startups that address needs of Asian immigrants in the United States. That creates more of a community rather than just plain banking services. Because that's what has to be about, right? It's not just about access to loans or access to credit. It's also about looking deeper into what does that community need? Why do they have such needs? So for example, the Daylight FinTech, that's the group that's focusing on LGBTQ consumers, they told me that, the specific challenges that people have when they go through the procedures, right? And when they change their names or, when they try to start a family, a lot of those challenges, there are over 30 million, if I remember, over 30 million of folks in the States that are LGBTQ community. And the specific challenges they go through are not something that incumbent banks have been able to address, right? And so now we're seeing more and more groups of people who have gone through, again, the lived experience and with the intent to create solutions for those groups of people. Now, my hope will be that people will look at it not as a marketing segment, but more so looking deeper into what else are we not doing and serving these people, and how can we create a more inclusive solution for more, instead of, keep going at the same product we've had for 30, 40 years. And earned wage access is another big thing that we have seen that fintech startups have started in the US, and that's prompting the incumbent banks to do more. So traditionally we get paid every 2 weeks, and you get your paycheck every 2 weeks, but that doesn't always line up with when people need to pay rent and pay utilities, all of their payment. And so there will be a few days in the gap where some of the folks have to reach in and to get a payday loan just to bridge over from paycheck to paycheck. And so fintech startups like Chime or a few others, they have dug into and creating the earned wage access to get people access to their paycheck earlier, so they don't have to dig into a payday fund. Now, that is a wonderful idea, and that was something that a lot of the banks started copying, right? So when we're thinking about how we work have changed and how a small group as a voice can create change, that's another great example. Because otherwise, banks have the ability to do that for a long time, and they just never did.
Yep. Well, it seems like technology can be used to solve problems, but it also is fantastic at surfacing problems in communities. And I think that commitment to a community is something that really works for a lot of people. So thank you. I want to ask you, if Monday morning, you get into work, or you're waking up and you want to do one thing, what do you think people could do? What's sort of one actionable piece of advice?
Wow. There are a lot, but so I would say find a subject that you're not as familiar with and try to learn more about it. Something that is out of the ordinary that you normally, would dig into, a specific social issues that's been propping up. So for example, with the Black Lives Movement from last year, I started getting a lot of books that go back into the history of redlining in the US and how that has brought about the challenges that we see as income inequality between the demographics in the United States. That is something that was built up from a long time ago. I strongly believe in looking back in history is how we can better understand why we are where we are today, and how we can create the change that we need for the future, because history always offers some sort of lesson. So if there's one thing that I think it is important for us all to do is learn from the past.
Absolutely. I like that. Looking back to look into the future, a true futurist answer, actually. So the other thing that everybody can do to learn something that's maybe not in their wheelhouse, some people maybe it is, but an excellent book is to get your book. And where can people find you?
Thank you. It's we have a website called beyondgoodbook.com.
All right.
Otherwise you can just get it in the big retail stores.
Fantastic. Well, did I do it right? Beyondgoodbook.com.
Yes.
Thank you for your time. It was fantastic. And I know a lot of us are going to have our own side discussions after that, because it was far too short. And I love the way that you end your book, which is let's write a better future together. So hopefully people can link into you and read your book and find you. It sounds like you're really trying to pull people together and catalyze change. So thank you for that. And you have a lot of people on the call who would like to help you do that, and collective lift of all
It's the
people.
collective, right? You can't do it by one, but like I mentioned earlier, and that's how I teach my kids. If you can get a few people together to create change, and they can get a few more people together to create change, that's how you create a movement. So it's a long journey, but there is hope. And that's why we ended the book with hope, because that's the one anchor that we all need right now, regardless of where we are.
Well, it's a lovely sentiment. Thank you so much, Theo. Thanks for coming in this morning and talking to us around the world. And thanks to all of you guys for coming into the Future Proof Masterclass and bringing your own views, because this is always like, a fabulous cocktail party that started during COVID and has ceased to end. So thank you very much. And we'll see you next month to talk about other ways to future proof.
Thank you.
Take care.